So there's this documentary that I first watched back when I was in college, and to be honest with you, I find myself thinking about it more and more as the years go by. The movie I'm talking about was called Cleanflix, which was a pretty bare bones documentary about a Utah-based company of the same name. Founded in the year 2000, Cleanflix was a business that would take popular movies and edit out supposedly objectionable material such as violence, nudity, and profanity, and would then turn around and either rent out or resell these quote-unquote sanitized versions to their more family-focused customers. And while Cleanflix is the business primarily focused on in this doc, the truth is the practice of re-editing and selling films has been around in one form or another basically since the advent of VHS. But the reason why Cleanflix specifically is the focal point of this film is because they were also the company that were the first to find themselves in the crosshairs of the Directors Guild of America, eventually leading to a legal battle that Cleanflix would go on to lose. Not only did this essentially put Cleanflix out of business virtually overnight, it also set a precedent that effectively wiped out any competing business as well. In other words, it definitively made the practice of producing re-edited films of any kind illegal. Now, although by this point in my YouTube career, I should probably know better than to make assumptions about my audience. But my guess is there's probably quite a few people out there who are expecting me to be happy about this particular outcome. To say something along the lines of, in matters such as these, we must always take up the sword and shield of integrity to defend all works of art from this kind of brazen and unethical censorship at all costs. And well, if you couldn't already tell from my liberal use of sarcasm there, I kinda think this issue is a bit more complicated than that. You see, in my opinion, the situation Cleanflix found themselves in is a rather fascinating one, because it touches on a few topics that have become even more relevant today than they were back when that initial lawsuit was resolved in 2006. Really, what we have at the heart of this issue is a debate about what it actually means to own a piece of art, and what you as a consumer are legally allowed to do with that piece of art once you own it. And as large media corporations continue to consolidate their vast libraries while also moving over to an all-digital streaming model, and as someone who in the face of this fact has continued to amass a fairly sizable Blu-ray collection myself, this is a debate that is very relevant to my own personal interests. But to be frank with you, this is also a problem with no simple solutions. And so if we really want to have a nuanced discussion about the matter, then we're going to have to do more than just simply say Cleanflix was clearly in the wrong here and then just wash our hands of the whole ordeal and call it a day. No, what we really need is more of a critique of sorts, an analysis of the topic, if you will. You know, like the kind of thing you might find in, say, an essay. But you know, just to make sure people actually pay attention to it and their eyes don't start to glaze over when they see all those words staring back at them on the page, it would probably be a good idea if someone took that essay and put it into like a video format or something. Anyway, I did that. I made that video already. So why don't we go ahead and watch it now? So, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is a fairly complex topic we're trying to talk about, so I'm going to do my best to try and break it down into chunks for us. For starters, I want to dig a little deeper into either side of the arguments of the original DGA versus Cleanflix dispute, while also providing a bit more background information about where the state of edited movies was back then and where it is today. You know, just so we can have a solid foundation to work off of from there. Now, one of the interesting things about the legal battle between Cleanflix and the DGA is that Cleanflix was actually the one to sue the DGA first, in what was essentially a legal preemptive strike of sorts. The reasoning for this was actually pretty simple. Basically, the writing had been on the wall for quite a while now. As the company itself had gotten more popular and other copycat businesses were beginning to pop up left and right, it was getting harder and harder for Cleanflix to stay under the radar. After all, it's one thing to run a small mom-and-pop video store in the Utah Valley, but it's another thing entirely to have Dan Rather talking about your business on the CBS Nightly News. And so, once Cleanflix and the other services like it had finally caught the unwanted attention of Hollywood, many of the directors whose works they had been editing weren't too happy about the liberties that were being taken with their art.
To alter these and then put them out with our names still on the product is not only fraud, but it's artistic rape.
If you don't like it, don't watch it. If you don't want your children to watch it, have some responsibility as a parent and turn it off.
And it has my name on it, and the implication is that I've condoned it or that it represents what I did.
How do you think we respond? It's wrong. It's just patently wrong.
Now, maybe I'm in the minority here, but I think one of the things that makes this case so tricky is that there isn't an obvious right or wrong side to this. The truth is, a lot of times in disputes such as these, we have a tendency to narrativize things in an attempt to figure out how we ultimately feel about a certain topic. And I'm sure for a lot of people, it's really easy to see clean flicks as the villains of this story. I mean, for the record, that is definitely how I felt when I first watched this film almost a decade ago. But now, I see things a little differently. Although I should probably also clarify, while I am open to the idea of defending what Clean Flicks was doing as a business, I'm not necessarily okay with also defending some of the people that actually worked for and created the company as well. For instance, take someone like Ray Lines, the original founder of Clean Flicks. Back when he was trying to defend his company from the impending lawsuits of Hollywood, one of his strategies was to boldly claim that he was actually doing a better job of editing these movies than the professionals were.
We sent the edited version over the satellite to the Today Show so they could show it on their clip. When we sent it, they said, okay, now send us the edited version. We said, we just did send you the edit. They're going, you're kidding, that was edited? And we're going, yeah, that was edited. That's, to me, the greatest compliment about Clean Flicks edited movies, is you can't tell that it's been edited. These movies are great movies, and they don't need all that crap in order to be great movies.
Which, yeah, I'm not gonna back you up on that one, buddy. Also, spoiler alert here, if that's even a thing that's possible for an 11-year-old documentary. But more importantly here, I also want to give you a quick content warning about a very brief discussion involving sex acts with minors. If you want to avoid either of those things, just skip ahead in the video like 30 seconds or so. So on top of the company's founder just being kind of a pompous ass, one of the local store owners, and basically kind of the de facto main character of the Clean Flicks documentary itself, Daniel Dean Thompson was, along with his business partner, charged by police for soliciting sex from two 14-year-old girls. So yeah, I will happily say with every fiber of my being, definitively, genuinely, fuck these guys. But at the same time, as much as I may not support many of the men behind Clean Flicks, I do still think many of the actual customers they sold movies to have some valid points. For example, one point that gets brought up early on in the doc is that Clean Flicks as a company was mostly just providing a service that the studios were refusing to offer. Like, edited versions of films are created all the time to play on both airplanes and television networks. But now, really the only way for your average consumer to obtain a copy of one of these movies is to basically just DVR it when it comes on TV. Well, as it turns out, while most directors don't explicitly bring it up very often, it seems like many of them aren't big fans of these officially sanctioned re-edits either. One good example is the TV version of Fast Times at Ridgemont High, originally directed by Amy Heckerling. Now, if you've seen the movie before, then you obviously know there's plenty of content in there that isn't going to be allowed to run on basic cable. But what makes the edited for TV version of Fast Times worth pointing out isn't just what got taken out of it, but what also got added back in. While different versions have appeared on television over the years, in some cases up to 14 minutes worth of previously cut content had to be re-edited back into the film, so it would still fit into a standard network runtime. On top of this, I mean, it's not like directors have final cut on every movie they make either. Hollywood is filled with directors who have horror stories about their films being taken away from them by the studios, either due to being replaced in the middle of shooting, or after the fact if they don't have any input on the actual edit itself. In fact, the Directors Guild has the official pseudonym Alan Smithy for any director to use if they want to avoid being credited on films where they feel like their original vision is no longer being represented. And while we're talking about the studios here, why weren't they making these edited versions of movies that had already been produced available to be purchased in the first place? After all, we know they're all about maximizing profitability. That's the main reason directors end up getting creative control wrestled away from them to begin with. Well, it seems that ever since the days of the original Clean Flicks lawsuit, their go-to answer has always been that there just simply isn't a market for them, which I think is a bit disingenuous. I mean, clearly there is a market for these films. It just seems like that market isn't currently deemed big enough to be worth also risking alienating every director they work with more than they already have. But all that being said, there is still one example in recent memory of a studio starting to dip their toes back into these sanitized waters themselves. Back in June of 2017, Sony Pictures was planning to launch what was reported to be a Clean Version Initiative, which would essentially provide the TV or airplane edits of certain movies as a bonus feature for digital purchases. This predictably did not go over well with many filmmakers and actors. Prominent names like Seth Rogen and Judd Apatow voiced their disgust at the potential program, although incidentally, neither of them actually had any movies that were a part of the initial 24 films the service was going to offer. But Adam McKay, who did have 2 movies included in that pilot program, did state that he had never been contacted, nor had he ever given his approval for any edited versions of his films to be made available. In response to the hostile reaction, Sony quickly backed down, first stating that it was their belief that they already had permission to release these previously produced edited versions of the films, and would remove any film from this catalog if the director requested so. In response, the DGA demanded that Sony go a step further by not including any movie without seeking permission first, and not simply removing them after the fact, which seemed to have been enough to cause Sony to quietly shutter the program altogether. Now, I'm not exactly sure if Sony could have just gone ahead and launched this program anyway without getting the director's permission first, but it does seem clear that these kind of tensions around censoring films not only exist from outside sources, but also within the studio system itself. My assumption is that the studios are allowed to produce sanitized versions of their movies for airplanes and televisions due to some baked-in contractual obligation, and directors mostly don't challenge that because, well, that's just kind of how things have been for a while now. Basically, it's just viewed as an unfortunate part of doing business. But when something new comes along, like CleanFlix or Sony's Clean Version program, which isn't already a part of the accepted system, well then it's a lot easier for directors to flex their muscles and shut it down. And so, time after time, artistic integrity has managed to prevail over the evils of corporate greed and shameless consumerism. That's maybe a weird thing to say derisively. Is this video gonna get me cancelled? Now, as a last thing to go over before we wrap this section up, I feel like we should go over what is currently the only way for a consumer to watch an edited for content movie that doesn't also involve buying a plane ticket or a cable package. That's right, despite the CleanFlix verdict nearly wiping out any retail version of this business, there is still one company operating today, and they're called ClearPlay. To the best of my understanding, ClearPlay essentially functions as a more precise version of parental controls. All you have to do is buy the modified Blu-ray player or download the web browser plugin if you're streaming online, and then just set the parental controls to what kind of content you want edited out of the movie you're about to watch. Presumably, someone at ClearPlay has already gone ahead and watched and cataloged the timecodes for all these different instances of objectionable material, and from there, the software simply uses that information to skip past any of those designated segments. Basically, you can think of it as the technological equivalent to watching a film with a parent that's already seen the movie, and knows exactly when to fast forward through that awkward sex scene. The catch here, and what allows ClearPlay to go on operating their business while other places like CleanFlix were forced to shut down is, since there isn't actually a new version of the film being created, technically this isn't a violation of copyright. It's still the same movie you originally bought, except now it's just being played by software that has a super efficient and automated fast forward button. And while I think from a legal perspective it's easy enough to understand this distinction, it also feels a lot like one of those letter of the law versus spirit of the law kind of situations, which I think is another complicating factor to this whole conundrum of ownership we're trying to figure out here. But to really proceed any further here, I think we need to spend some time digging into what copyright law actually is, how it functions, and most importantly of all, who stands to benefit the most from how it gets enforced. But if we are going to be spending a significant amount of time talking about legal stuff, then we do need to get this quick disclaimer out of the way first. Now, hopefully this goes without saying, but I'm not a lawyer, and copyright law is a very complicated thing that varies quite a lot depending on both the country you're in and the type of product you're actually talking about. But the good thing is, at least as it pertains to our discussion today, I don't really need to get every nuance and exception to the rule perfect. Like I said at the beginning of part 1, all we're really looking for here is a decent base to work off of. Because if we want to eventually work our way up to having a discussion about what you should be allowed to do with a piece of art, then I think it's important for us to also first establish what you already are allowed to do with that same piece of art. And so with that, what do you say we go ahead and get ourselves educated a little bit here? So in my mind, the confusing part about copyright law isn't so much about what you can't do, but more a problem of why you can't do it. And I can definitely say from personal experience here, once you actually sit down and start digging into a lot of those different whys, the line between what should legally be considered right and wrong starts to get pretty blurry. For example, as previously mentioned, the owners and operators of CleanFlix knew that their business was built on some pretty shaky ground legally, and there was no way they were going to be able to get by making just a single edited version of these blockbusters and then selling dozens of copies off of that one edit. So what they did to get around this problem was to institute what they referred to as a one-to-one rule. Originally, if you wanted to get an edited movie from Cleanflix, what you had to do is go to the store and buy the original unedited DVD of the movie yourself, then physically send that movie to Cleanflix through the mail, after which they would rip the movie off the disc, edit it, burn the alternate version onto a new separate disc, and finally send you back both copies through the post office. And once they made the eventual leap to opening brick and mortar stores, they always made sure to buy a legal copy for every altered version of the movies they rented or sold. Or at least that's what they were supposed to do. Now, the reason Cleanflix thought this was going to be a valid workaround for any copyright violations is because of a little thing called the first sale doctrine. Basically, first sale doctrine is an important part of the broader copyright law in America, and is commonly believed to mean that once a person buys a physical copy of any piece of art, it is essentially within their rights to do whatever they want with it.
It's my copy. I pay $19.95 for it.
I can play flying saucer with it. I can build a bonfire with it.
I have the right to take it to a company like Cleanflix and have them alter it for me.
When you sell it to me in the store, it's mine. I can have it. I can keep it. I can alter it if I want to. I can do what I want.
You don't actually own the DVD, you just own the right to view it. I understand that. But in people's mind across the country or the world, if they bought a DVD, they can do it with what they want, including editing it and producing an alternative copy of it.
But unfortunately for Cleanflix, while for the most part in America you are allowed to rent, sell, or even alter any physical piece of media that you buy, you do start to run into a lot more problems once you start trying to do all three of those things at the exact same time.
If I want to sit at home and take the Star Wars trilogy and do my own version and make it 2 hours long and watch it in my living room, that I'm allowed to do that. What I'm not allowed to do is sell it.
And eventually, the judge in the Cleanflix lawsuit ended up seeing things much in the same way that Mr. Soderbergh does in that clip we just saw. The problem is, while first sale doctrine does specifically give you the right to rent out or resell any physical copy of a film that you own, it technically does not allow you to alter that copy in any way, even if you're not trying to profit off of it. The catch for that last part is, if you're not actually trying to make any money off of an altered version of a film, well then there's also a really low chance that a studio is going to find out and try and do something about it. Basically, it's just not really worth anyone's time to call the cops on you every time you invite a few buddies over on the weekend to watch the special version of the Iron Lady you made with a bunch of fart noises edited back in.
Do you know, one of the great problems of our age is that we are governed by people who care more about feelings than they do about thoughts and ideas.
So legally speaking, just because Cleanflix was buying a legal copy for every edited DVD they rented or sold, they still didn't have permission from the original copyright owner, that being either the studio or the director, to make alterations to that copy in any way. And thus, this ended up being a pretty open and shut case. But I want to take this a step further and try and understand, why is it illegal for you to alter a work of art, even if you're not trying to profit off of it? And to do that, I'm going to walk us through two examples of just how complicated copyright disputes can get. So one of the key aspects to first sale doctrine is, when you go to the store to buy a Blu-ray or DVD of your favorite movie, you are specifically buying a physical copy, with the two most important words there being both physical and copy. Because if you're buying a piece of art and those two words can't apply to it, well then that purchase is no longer under the protection of the first sale doctrine, or at least not in the same way. And just so you know, this is also why digital purchases of media can be so tricky from a copyright perspective. Because when you buy something printed on a disc, that is a wholly separate copy that will eventually degrade over time. But when you buy a digital version of a piece of media, that is essentially a perfect recreation that's never going to degrade. And while that might seem like a pretty minor distinction to both you and me, at least legally speaking, that's enough of a distinction to place digital media into a separate category entirely. Which is also why it's pretty rare for you to be able to resell or refund digital purchases that you make. So essentially, since there is no law explicitly saying that companies have to let you return or resell your digital goods, they don't. Yet another wonderful example of the free market at work. But hey, let's switch things up a bit. What if instead of just buying a copy of a piece of art, I were to go out and buy an original work? Like, say, the Mona Lisa, just so we can stop talking about film for a few minutes. Look, I'm currently on unemployment, which Mitch McConnell has informed me means I'm very rich. So I think I can pretty easily afford to buy the Mona Lisa, okay? Now getting back on topic, how does copyright law work in this scenario? Can I still resell or alter the Mona Lisa in any way that I see fit? Well, the answer is both yes and no. While I am now the prestigious owner of this one-of-a-kind painting, I still don't fully own the copyright for it. And of course, I am bending the rules a little bit here so I can use a universally recognized example. And technically things do get a bit more complicated if an artist is already dead. But if we were to pretend for a second that Leonardo da Vinci were still alive, then he would be the original copyright owner. So what that in turn means is I am still within my rights to resell or alter this painting, I just may need to get certain permissions from Leo first. As far as altering the painting itself goes, things do get a bit messy. If I wanted to say, cut the Mona Lisa up into various pieces for whatever reason, it is still possible for Mr. Da Vinci to prevent me from doing that. But he would have to legally prove that my altering of this painting is in some way harmful to what is described as his honor or reputation, or that the painting itself is of a recognized stature. Now obviously both of those criteria are pretty subjective, but luckily for Leo, since the Mona Lisa is one of the most well-known paintings in the entire world, he'd have a pretty good chance of proving that in a court of law. But of course, if you were a lesser-known artist whose name doesn't appear in literally every art history textbook, you might have a harder time doing that. Thankfully though, the rights around reselling an original work of art are a lot more straightforward. For instance, let's just say the Senate refused to pass a second stimulus package and my unemployment benefits got cut by 75%, while the rest of the Senate members just got to go on vacation. But I mean, that would never actually happen, right? I mean, we're in the middle of a global pandemic here. I'm doing great over here. Hey, did you guys know that I have a Patreon? So hypothetically, let's just say that for some reason, I needed to make some quick cash and decided to sell this wonderful painting to someone else. Well then, there's not really much Leo can do to stop me from selling his work however I see fit. The only thing he can do at this point is to have the piece listed anonymously, much like how the pseudonym Alan Smithy works for film directors. Now, in this particular example, this wouldn't really do him much good since the Mona Lisa is recognizable enough on its own. But if it were, say, a lesser-known Da Vinci painting, then this might be a useful tactic to get one over on me, since his name might be what's adding most of the actual value to the piece. But once again, if you're not someone who's as famous as Leonardo is, then you're probably not going to benefit from this to anywhere near the same degree. But why don't we take this even a step further with our next example? Let's talk about tattoos for a moment. So in some respects, tattoos could be considered one of the most intimate and personal forms of art out there. I mean, you are literally getting a piece of art permanently affixed to your skin, so I really don't know how you could own a piece of art more than that. But when it comes to a matter of copyright, you can still run into a lot of the same issues we've already been talking about. Take the case of tattoo artist Catherine Alexander. Now, while you may not have ever heard of Alexander herself, if you are a fan of professional wrestling, then there's a good chance you've already seen her work on the excessively tanned and liberally oiled up body of one Randy Orton. And on the surface, there's nothing wrong with a wrestler getting a bit of ink done. I mean, many other wrestlers have tattoos. But where the problem comes in is that Randy's tattoos, or I guess for the purposes of this discussion, I should really be saying Catherine Alexander's tattoos on Randy's body, have been frequently reproduced in the annual WWE video game. So technically speaking, these video games are digitally reproducing Alexander's work, making a copy of them, which since she is the original artist and thus the copyright holder, and because she has not given the game developers permission to recreate her work, that would legally be considered a violation of copyright law, which is exactly what she is alleging in her current lawsuit against the WWE and 2K Games. Now, interestingly enough, this is far from the first time that tattoo artists or other high-profile athletes have had legal disputes with video game publishers. But if the developers are smart enough to think ahead, the usual way they try and get around this issue is either by replacing the tattoos in-game with a design that looks similar but is also just different enough to still be considered legally distinct. Or, they just remove the tattoo entirely. And just in case you're out there saying, okay, this is starting to get a bit ridiculous now, and also so I can win back a few points by sticking up for the artist here, let me tell you why I think these tattoo artists are justified for taking legal action against these companies. Well, personally, I'm not really a huge fan of the particular tattoos Mr. Orton has decided to put on his body. I do think they are a part of what makes him stand out as a performer and a wrestler. His tattoos aren't nearly as iconic as other wrestlers such as Bill Goldberg, Brock Lesnar, or The Rock, all of whom have prominent tattoos that have frequently been a part of official merchandise and are generally considered to be part of their overall image and brand. But Randy Orton's tattoos are still just as much a part of his visual iconography. If you were to fire up the latest WWE 2K game and scroll over to Randy Randy Orton, and both his arms weren't completely sleeved in tattoos, he would kinda just look like a generic wrestler dude. He wouldn't fully look like Randy Orton anymore. So I think you can pretty easily make the argument that Alexander's work, which she has not given the copyright over to WWE or the Apex Predator himself, is a vital part of accurately portraying Randy in the video game. And furthermore, I ultimately think it's pretty telling when games try to get away with stuff like this and when they decide to do their legal due diligence. Like, back when CM Punk was still in the WWE, the games never tried to recreate the very prominent Cobra logo that was tattooed on one of his shoulders. Because Hasbro, the owner of the G.I. Joe copyright which the logo falls under, is a big company that has enough money to actually put up a fair legal battle if they wanted to. And of course, I know things get a little messy from there since Hasbro isn't literally the person who tattooed that logo onto CM Punk's arm, but I think you get my overall point with this. But now that we've spent the first 2/3 of this video laying all this groundwork, I think it's time we finally actually did some analysis here. Okay, so now that I've inundated you with all this wonderful new information, let's roll everything back to where this video originally began, with the fight between Cleanflix and the Directors Guild. Now, if we take a closer look at some of the DGA's key talking points through the lens of what we've just gone over, I think we could find some pretty obvious holes in their logic. Like, if one of their main points of contention is that it is wrong, not just legally, but ethically, to alter these movies in any way because it still has the credited director's name attached to it, while also no longer representing their full artistic vision, well then we've already touched on some reasons as to why that line of thinking is fundamentally pretty flawed. Not only have I already mentioned multiple ways that even theatrical releases of a film can have their creative visions compromised, are we also really supposed to believe that people were buying movies from Cleanflix under the assumption that they were getting the official Hollywood-approved version? Because that's ridiculous. Of course they weren't expecting that. I mean, that's the whole reason they were going to Cleanflix in the first place. They specifically did not want to watch the director's original edit. And if the real problem here is simply just a matter of improperly crediting the directors, would it have been okay if Cleanflix had simply edited in a quick disclaimer up top, literally telling the audience that the version of this film they were about to watch had been edited for content? My guess is no, that wouldn't have saved Cleanflix either. To me, the real problem here is that the directors believe that their cut is the one true version of the film they made, and anything outside of that is tantamount to heresy, nothing more than an imposter that, by definition, should not be allowed to exist. But even though I think that assertion is at least a lot more honest, I still have plenty of problems with it. Primarily because it plays into auteur theory in some unhealthy ways. Now, auteur theory is historically another thorny topic to try and tackle, but for anyone not already aware, it's basically a philosophy of criticism that looks at film from the perspective of the director being the primary creative force behind it, the one true author of the work, if you will. But over the years, many critics have taken issue with auteur theory because they rightfully so believe it unfairly flattens the filmmaking process in ways that overlook all the hard work put in by people who aren't the director. Like, even if we look at a dream scenario for a director, where they were given final cut over the edit, where they oversaw the entirety of the filming process, plus both pre- and post-production. Even then, saying that a film's creation should solely be attributed to the director is a gross oversimplification. Were they also the only writer on the project, the lone cinematographer? Did the actors not have any creative input into their performance? Even tiny independent films are still made by teams of artists. And sure, maybe sometimes people end up having to wear multiple hats during a shoot, but movies are not made by a single person. They're a collective artistic endeavor. And I'm sure by now you're starting to see what I'm getting at with all this. But indulge me just a little bit and let me throw a few more thought experiments your way that also cover a few topics I've already touched on in earlier videos. First off, let's talk about translated subtitles for a second. Now, even if we were to concede that last point we just made and assume that a film truly can be considered wholly created by its director, then by that same logic, shouldn't we also consider translated subtitles to be a significant alteration of that film? Well, unless the same director already knows every language that their film is being translated into and can therefore at least verify them for authenticity, yeah, I would say subtitles should also be considered tampering with a director's original vision. But of course, we don't really view subtitles like that, right? They're paid for by the studios and created by industry professionals, and presumably the directors have already contractually allowed them to be attached to their film. Basically, they're just another aspect of filmmaking that is sort of accepted as part of the process. Plus, and I mean, this is the real kicker here, it also makes the film much more profitable since it can now be sold in many more markets. Now, is each one of those foreign markets also bigger than the potential consumer base that would happily buy edited movies? Who's to say? But at least in this regard, subtitles do have a substantial leg up, because they don't inherently bother directors like re-editing films do. And you know what? While we're meeting the directors halfway here, why don't we kick things up a notch? Let's go ahead and ask the question, is it really that important that you watch a movie in the way the director originally intended? And I'm sure this is another area where some people might have the knee-jerk reaction to say, yes, of course it's important. And alright, fine. But let's talk about a little thing called subjective interpretation. You see, the thing is, I can understand why a director would be so adamant about their film not being messed around with by anyone other than themselves. Because the objective elements of a film, the ways in which it is literally constructed, are really the only aspects to the film that are completely within their control. The unavoidable truth is, once you actually finish your cherished work of art and start to share it with an audience, your ability to control its meaning begins to evaporate rather quickly. You as an artist might know exactly what your art means to you, what it symbolizes, what it is ultimately trying to say, but not every viewer is going to come to that same conclusion. Even if you're both looking at the same piece, seeing the same visuals, hearing the same words or music, undoubtedly your two personal interpretations of what that art means are going to diverge in some ways. To steal a phrase from one of my earlier videos, sharing art with an audience is a lot like imperfect telepathy, in that there's always going to be something that winds up getting lost in translation. Here, to wrap this point up, let me phrase it another way. I think by virtue of growing up in a highly consumer-focused culture, most of us have a pretty good idea about what it means to physically own a piece of art. But what does it mean to own a piece of art mentally? What does it mean when you watched a movie and it had such a strong effect on you that you can literally remember where you were sitting in the theater when you first watched it? What does it mean when you watch a movie so many times that you can effortlessly recite every line from memory? It might sound a little strange to say that mentally, that emotionally, you now own a piece of that film in your heart. But at the very least, I think we can feel comfortable saying that a piece of that art has been given to you. It has been shared with you. And I mean, that's great. That's the beauty of art in action right there. So when we go out and buy that movie on DVD, or pre-order the excessively expensive 4K collector's edition, when we spend hundreds of dollars to frame a signed poster of it, or even if we go so far as to memorialize that film by getting it tattooed onto our bodies, we are trying in some way to give permanence and stability to this otherwise intangible relationship that we have frustratingly continued to lose control of more and more over time. Look, there's a reason why I continue to stockpile a clearly dying medium like Blu-rays in the year 2020. Because when I watch a movie and I like it so much that I know I'm going to want to be able to go back and rewatch it, I want to feel confident that I can actually do that. And not have to worry that I'm subscribed to the one random streaming service I need, or that it hasn't just disappeared off the face of the internet entirely. Hell, there's a reason why the only media service I still subscribe to is getting DVDs from Netflix. Because unlike almost everywhere else, if there's something I want to watch, there's actually like a 90% chance they're gonna have it. I don't think there's anything wrong with loving art. I think there's something truly pure and human about that. But we also have to contend with the fact that our connection to art is immediately compromised once you start to factor in commerce and profitability into the equation. I mean, morally speaking, should anyone really be able to own a piece of art in the first place? Part of the reason why it sounds so strange to say that you mentally own a piece of art is that the term ownership implies a sense of exclusivity. If it is a one-of-a-kind piece and you are the person who owns it, that also means that no one else is allowed to have it. You are in control of who has access to it. And while over time we've grown accustomed to this defining our physical relationship to art, that doesn't really mesh very well with how we define our emotional relationship to it. Ideally, artists wouldn't have to worry about profiting off their work so that they can pay rent or put food on the table. But, although admittedly it does feel like we're getting closer and closer to this with every day, the people have as of yet fully risen up to overthrow the state and install their own socialist utopia. So for the time being, operating within this current capitalist framework is really all we have to work with. And so because of that, if multi-million-dollar companies like the WWE and Take-Two Interactive are going to profit off a single artist's work like Catherine Alexander's, well then, you're damn right I think she's entitled to some of that money. But the reason why I've been taking such a harsher tone with the directors featured in this video is because, well, for starters, I don't think any of them are necessarily hurting for cash these days. But I also don't think they're adequately reckoning with the role they play in the larger capitalist system they're a part of. Like I said, I can understand why directors are so protective of their movies. After all, actual censorship is something that artists have been fighting against for literal centuries now. But when it comes to what is, in my mind, the fairly minor issue of offering family-friendly versions of their movies to the people who want them, frankly, I just don't really see that as a problem. All I really see here is a bunch of directors using their privileged relationship with the studio system and the vagaries of copyright law to impose their own subjective view of how art should be engaged with on an otherwise potential audience. And personally, I think that's a pretty regressive philosophy, because I think it's important for art to be made available to as many people as possible. If I'm going to be out here making videos that say all art is inherently subjective, and that those different interpretations are what makes art special, if I'm going to be making videos that say that you should be allowed to engage with a piece of media in any way that best suits your needs, then I can't really turn around and say that you aren't allowed to make re-edited versions of films just because I don't agree with your worldview. That, in and of itself, would feel hypocritical. So, as I start to wrap things up here, I do want to be sure I'm crystal clear on a few things. For starters, I am not, under any circumstance, out here advocating for censoring art. What I am advocating for is freedom of choice. By no means am I saying that the original versions of these movies shouldn't exist. And if you want to make it so that you have to buy the unedited version first before you get the cleaned up version as a special feature, I've got no problem with that. I'll even agree with you that by and large, these sanitized versions are worse than their unedited counterparts. But I still think they should be made available. Ultimately, I think it should be up to the individual to decide what kind of experience they want, even if I believe it's a lesser one. To put it as plainly as I can, I think people have the right to be wrong. And I realize you might be saying to yourself, Drew, buddy, that's starting to sound awfully libertarian of you. Not really a good look there. Well, let me throw just one more hypothetical your way. So, you know how one of the things we're trying to do in more progressive media criticism circles is to normalize the idea of content warnings, i.e. trigger warnings? Well, let's think about how that could apply to something like ClearPlay. For example, let's say that you're someone who has a particularly triggering trauma in your past, and there's certain material that you just can't comfortably engage with at this point in your life. Now, maybe you don't need the full ClearPlay experience, like perhaps you don't really care about hearing offensive language. But wouldn't it be nice if you could use this technology to, with laser-targeted accuracy, avoid watching scenes that have certain types of violence or intolerance depicted in them? Are you still getting the full experience as the director originally intended? No, clearly not. But you are at least still getting some experience. I think it's important to remember most of the people who stand to benefit from something like this aren't paid movie critics who need to see the full thing to give a complete opinion on the piece. These are just people who'd like to watch the new popular movie and still be able to sleep soundly later that same night. And if you want to make the argument that if a movie as it was originally created offends you, you should simply just not watch it, well, I'll just say this. Isn't even a compromised version of a great piece of art better than nothing at all? Like, let's say there's a kid out there who has some very conservative parents that won't let them watch any movie above a PG rating. Isn't there at least some benefit to them broadening their artistic horizons, even if it's only just a little bit? Plus, I mean, you have no idea what aspects to a film are going to resonate with a person, and what ideas they're going to take away from it. After all, folks have been watching the uncensored version of The Matrix for quite a while now, and Lord knows plenty of people have still been taking all the wrong lessons from that movie. But at the same time, there's also plenty of people out there who have taken good things away from The Matrix as well, and I'm willing to bet you could still get some benefit from watching it, even without the sex or the violence. For me personally, I don't really need something like Cleanflix or ClearPlay in my life. My preference is usually going to be to just watch the unedited version of something, and if there is something offensive in there, I'm fine with taking that in and forming my own opinion of it. But not everyone is like me. We don't all have the same needs. And so long as it's not hurting anyone, which in my opinion re-edited movies are not doing that, then I'm always going to support the side that opens art up to the most amount of people. And I'm sure as hell not going to defend the side that is only making decisions based solely on what is the most profitable for them. But at the same time, hey, that's just my 2 cents, so take it for what it's worth. Hey, thanks for watching my video, and I hope you liked it. Honestly, I have no idea how people are going to respond to this one. Oh, and by the way, that joke about me needing money earlier was mostly for comedic effect. I'm doing relatively fine, all things considered, so please don't donate to me thinking I'm not going to be able to eat tonight or anything. Trust me, there are much more worthwhile causes to donate to than me. But if you do have some extra cash laying around and you would like to support my work, then the Patreon is still the best place to do that. For just $1 a month, you get a ton of extra bonuses like early access to videos, monthly Q&As, as well as extra bonus videos whenever I find the time. And if you are strapped for cash, you can always help out by engaging in the time-honored YouTube tradition of liking, commenting, or sharing the video. Alright, that's all I have for you today, so until next time, I'll just say my name's Drew, and you've been watching Select Screen.